And so on and so on. 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 And so on and so on.
Are you working on a sick moustache there, William?
Yeah, I was thinking,
Yeah.
Are you? You're.
I love it.
Are you? Is it an experiment when you're in social isolation to see if you can?
Yeah,
do it?
well, I've been doing it for like I think this is my 4th or 5th time trying it because it's always just an exercise in complete failure and like emasculation. But I'm not around anyone for like 3 weeks, and I'm like, okay, now I'm really gonna try to grow a mustache. I mean, I'm looking at Michael, and I feel like a boy looking at the hulking muscles of like.
Yeah. Someday you'll go through puberty.
I feel like I'm like a 18-year-old guy trying to be cool.
It's a good identity for you.
Ouch. When Jake and I were in Spain, like as soon as we got there, like 8 o'clock in the morning, we were walking down the street and there was a lemon tree in someone's yard. And me or Jake, I forget who, jumped over and snagged a lemon off it and then hopped back over. And he and I, like in rapture, demolished this lemon between us, like ate the skin and all, like passed it back and forth, like, oh my God.
Grinding around.
People here, at least, and I know in the US, really shit on Australia, but I feel like it's probably better than people give it credit for.
I'd say so.
Yeah, the bad mouth them their personalities as well.
Mm.
You know, I think you're all right.
Which, like, everyone in the world knows that Americans are the most objectionable people.
Yeah.
Mm.
It's just funny that they don't know that and they keep trying to like pin it on someone else.
Yeah.
They're like, oh, British people are so annoying.
Yeah, they're so like racist and fat and like their country is crumbling. It's like, okay, man.
I like English people generally, except
me too.
posh people. I can't stand posh people. It stands for posh out starboard home. So the people that were really wealthy when they were getting on the boat along the river, they would sit on the port side to not look at the poor part of the city, and then on the way home they would sit on the starboard side. It's kind of neat.
Yeah,
It is. Yeah. I'll use that at the Christmas lunch.
It's
My
interesting
English
that the
grandparents.
word that English people have for their upper class, it literally comes from their aversion to the lower classes.
yeah.
And that's also why in London, I think it's the west part of the city is where all the rich people live. And in New York, it's in the Upper East Side. And that's because those were the parts of the city that were upwind. So they weren't downwind from the poor people.
I like these little
And all the
factoids, William.
smells.
I was reflecting that wind is my least favorite weather phenomenon the other day.
You don't like wind.
Oh, you know, in normal conditions. Wind chill, it's called.
Don't let its relaxed name fool you.
Okay, so we haven't done a Just the Fellows episode since like November or September or something like that. We just need to take a bit of a break, I suppose. Now we're back. We got some good plans. We had a great conversation with Matt Fleisfetter last week. Fucking just a fountain of seamless information, that guy.
Incredible.
Yeah, the breadth of knowledge is crazy with Matt.
Yeah. And what else? You spoke to Sophie Fiennes. How was that, Mike?
Sophie was awesome.
She's fucking cool.
What a cool lady.
Very cool.
Just kind of inspiring engagement with the world.
Yeah, big time.
And really interesting too that, as she said, she is not formally educated, at least on the university level. But it's really interesting how she's working with all of these ideas through an art form, which seems more rare. And she's also like incredibly articulate in describing that.
What other milestones? Oh,
Matt's course.
Yeah, that was great. Very thankful that he did that with us. And they're all on Patreon. If someone wants to join our Patreon, there's the reading group that we did on For Where We Know Not What We Do with Matt, and tons of extra episodes. Yeah, we got some good interviews coming up. And also, if you want to, we're going to have the second half of our conversation with Matt up next week. If you want to hear that, join our Patreon.
Žižek emailed us.
Oh, did he?
Yeah.
What did he say?
He said, "Thank you very much for all of the work that you guys have been doing. I really appreciate it." Something like that.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Hang on, I'll find what he said.
What the fuck?
What does he say? "Dear friends, I'm so impressed by your work. We should keep in touch!" Exclamation point by 5 S.
That's very sweet.
That's great.
Approval from the master. I thought it was kind of like that scene from The Fountainhead where it's like, tell me, what do you really think of me? And Žižek was like, I don't really think of you at all.
I think that's the real situation.
The chat bot thing, Mike,
Mm.
you were talking with it about Žižek, right?
Yeah. I was asking, like, what is Žižek most renowned for? And it was that he was a trained classical pianist who's performed in public.
Like, where could it possibly come up with that? We were joking that, like, Žižek would play piano the same way that he types at a computer, like with two pointer fingers. But he wouldn't play any Wagner. Speaking of podcasts and Žižek, and of course, our material is drawn from Žižek. We're a Žižekian podcast. We don't present ourselves as professionals or academics, but we're into his work. I feel like we have some familiarity with the way that he writes and thinks. Other people use him, I think, for different reasons. For clicks, maybe, for algorithms, for more listenership, and maybe like to have him comfortably in a little box. But the moment that he doesn't fit in that box, they fucking freak out. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's just a good example of maybe you just don't agree with Žižek, and that's fine. But just pretending that he can just kind of like be dropped in here and there just so you can like gain a little boost from people who just genuinely want to learn about him, and then just freak out and throw him away the second he doesn't fit into that little box. Maybe consider your relationship with how you want to use his thought. Boom. And speaking of recent things that he's written, we have a new Žižek book. It's called Žižek Responds! In which there's like a series of essays where people provide critiques of Žižek and he responds.
Great concept for a book.
And we chose an essay that Todd wrote called Slavoj Žižek is not violent enough.
Which, as he says right at the beginning, coyly using one of Žižek's formulations against him, because Žižek commonly says that X wasn't X enough. And actually going back to liberal outrage, that time that Žižek said that Hitler wasn't violent enough, or that Gandhi wasn't violent enough.
Yeah, those are big events in the canceling of in the long arc of the canceling of Žižek. But which and the Trump thing, obviously, but if you actually like have the generosity to understand what he means, it's not an outrageous claim.
No.
Yeah, and Todd actually says, like, often critics of Žižek will not only give an incredibly ungenerous reading of what he's saying, but actually just attribute the reverse idea to Žižek. And I think it's pertinent too, because Todd starts this out by saying, this is one of Žižek's more like railed against ideas, not only in the liberal left, but also on the right. Conservatives have a big problem with this. The notion of revolutionary violence and terror. This is a hobby horse of Žižek's. He talks about it a lot. I was recently reading, I'm still reading In Defense of Lost Causes, and that's what this whole book is about. Mm-hmm. Also, his introduction to Robespierre's book and Lenin's book and Mao's books. He deals with this concept a lot. And actually, before, I don't know if you're down with this, but because I'm reading that book right now, it was speaking to a lot of what he's saying in that book, in his essay on Robespierre. So I just wanted to do a little riff on that before we get going on Todd, just to give people an idea of what Žižek means, like why he would talk about Mao and Robespierre, these figures that people commonly associate with the excesses of complete horrendous violence. So yeah, Todd starts out with this idea that people who think Žižek's comments, people think that these comments, particularly with Žižek, are inflammatory. For instance, his comments on like Mao and Robespierre, like I was just saying, revolutionary terror. I think the people that are inflamed by that are, precisely who Žižek is identifying in his critique, that feeling itself. So people who, as Žižek writes, think of themselves as innocent, quoting him here, there are no innocent bystanders in the crucial moments of revolutionary decision, because in such moments, innocence itself, exempting oneself from decision, is the highest treason. This fear itself demonstrates that my subjective position is external to the revolution, that I experience the revolution as an external force threatening me. And, it's interesting to think of that subjective position trying to throw a spanner in the works of that logic that comes out of the feeling of the revolution threatening you. I think it's a really good point.
Mm.
And Žižek points out that true subjects of the revolution have nothing to lose. Paraphrasing Marx there, obviously. Nothing to lose but their chains. People who deride Žižek for an apparent lack of humanity, I think, are totally missing the point. And it's, again, precisely what Žižek calls an inhuman position, which he says, following Lacan, quoting here, confronts the inhuman core of humanity. This does not mean an ethics which no longer denies, but fearlessly takes into account the latent monstrosity of being human. And this inhuman dimension can be defined as that of a subject subtracted from all forms of human individuality or personality, which would continue to bind the subject to the ruling capitalist system. And while there's something terrifying about that in the attitude, something, admittedly terrifying in the attitude of Mao proclaiming that the Chinese people's disappearance in a nuclear holocaust would mean nothing to the universe, or Castro's wager on the heroic readiness of the Cuban people to risk its disappearance. Žižek's point is this, that terror is nothing less than the condition of freedom. Such an inhuman position of absolute freedom, he says, coincides with an absolute subjection to a task, is what perhaps characterizes the revolutionary subject at its innermost.
That's great.
So laying the groundwork there, I think that goes nicely into Todd's article. And as a sidebar, I think it's very interesting there. He uses the word task because he could have used the word project. So food for thought.
Or act.
Or duty.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I just wanted to tickle the start bone there.
Yeah. Alluding to the idea that the subject kind of inured and accepting the status quo is itself a position of a choice. And
it's not a neutral position.
And a violent position. For instance, he was talking about in the Revolutionary Act that they're kind of called to action, but also you can imagine that in the rise of Nazism, the general population's kind of acceptance and inaction of the rise of this form of this ideology was a kind of participation in it.
Yeah, very true.
And beyond that, that accepting the kind of terror, the violence of a revolution is maybe the only way of accessing the possibility of a kind of potentially different framework system.
Yeah, it's what he says, that that's the very condition of freedom.
Yeah.
Terror.
And that there's also something terrifying about the unknown, right? There's like into kind of both senses of the word of terror.
Definitely. Yeah.
So maybe we'll just start where he starts. So he says, Slavoj Žižek is not an advocate of aggressive violence, but the fundamental act of violence for Žižek is not one of lashing out aggressively at others and harming them. It involves instead striking at oneself. So Todd is going to emphasize that kind of violence, and the violence for Žižek kind of starts with the self. I'm not so sure that's true, but I think it's true for Todd, has a special focus on Lacanianism over Marxism. So he says, only by striking at itself can the subject cut into its own ideological investment that prevents it from imagining and actualizing a radical alternative.
I think it's true of, I think Žižek does say that. A very good example of it, or obvious example of it, is in his part of Sophie's film on They Live. The inordinately long fight scene for Žižek speaks to how difficult it is to penetrate the ideological field, but also how much work is required to strike at oneself. I think he makes that point that, they're like, it's a fight scene. They're violently striking one another. And for him, this is what's required to put one's ideological investment to the test.
Absolutely. And also it's the very moment, or the very existence of like the self as such is a violent act, because it involves a kind of exception to just bare pure being.
Exactly. Yeah.
It needs to. It's like the negative inserted into being, again, to use Star Trek terminology. But
and to paraphrase a paraphrase of a paraphrase, but I think you could say something like, "What is violence compared with the violence of subjectivity itself?"
I was thinking about this, like where the politically correct position, where like even disagreeing with someone is an act of violence, and how kind of ridiculous that is to many people's ears, no less the right. I feel like most people's intuitive response to that is, well, that's kind of ridiculous. But then I was thinking, like, that's not actually, there's some truth in that. But the difference then is how that violence impacts us, or what the role of violence is. Because sure, there is.
I mean, it depends on whose behalf you feel violated on.
Yeah, and violence for Žižek is not a good enough reason to not do it, right? Like for the politically correct position, violence, any existence of it is to be done away with. Whereas for Žižek, violence means something very different. So sure, speech might be violence, but it might be a violence required to act.
Totally. Yeah, like you think of like a revolutionary proclamation of some kind, like the Communist Manifesto, for instance. There is a violence wrapped up in that proclamation, but the violence is against the infinitely more violent system that keeps workers in their chains.
Yeah, it's the uprooting of existing relations, right?
Yeah, and this is something that Todd is really good at laying out, that people have a lot of difficulty with at first brush, with this idea that there is actually an incredible amount of violence in the normal run of things that we just don't see.
Yep. People are really normally very familiar with the concept of communism being violent, the gulags in Soviet Russia, or, just endless, like the Cultural Revolution. But there is, equally, if not greater, there is enormous violence to the capitalist system, be it wars or how the very functioning of the system requires extractions in faraway countries. The very lives that people live in the center depend on the exploitation of the lives of those outside of the center.
Yeah. So the point is that it's already painful. The way that the system sustains itself is already painful. And the trepidation lies in the idea that any kind of change would be painful. And it's like, no, it already is. It already is.
That itself is not a good enough reason to dismiss the concept of violence being used towards emancipation.
The point is that any type of change would be violent. And it's violent according to what appears neutral to us.
Yeah.
Position.
What are you comparing it to? Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Oh, yeah. So there's there's violence either way. and using and dismissing a kind of thoughtful approach to violence doesn't do the work that its arguers think that it does.
Well, another way of approaching it would be like, okay, so if we were to change the basic coordinates of how we exist, could it happen in such a seamless way where nothing was impacted or affected? No, right? Like, can you incrementally,
gradual,
right?
Yeah, can you in the gradualist way move towards emancipation? Žižek does not think so.
No, and I think most everyday people don't think so.
But I was just going to say, it's amazing.
I would say liberals think that.
How strong the idea is. It goes back to like the end of history notion that actually, liberal capitalism represents the culmination of a political system in the sense that it feels like it doesn't enact explicit violence on people. But obviously, I mean, it's not hard to point out that might be the case for someone living comfortably in the bosom of Western liberal democracies, quote unquote. And as Michael was just saying, like, it wouldn't necessarily feel that way in a cobalt mine in Africa. But it's, we've done an episode on violence before, and Žižek has a whole book on it. It's a great book. And in that book, he parses a distinction between what he calls objective violence and subjective violence. And what a lot of people think violence is what he calls subjective violence. That is violence that occurs on a kind of everyday level. Let's say like domestic abuse or violence on the streets. It's what conservatives think violence is. I think that's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah.
Crime rates.
Well, I was going to make that point. It's It's what conservatives speak of as violence. And it's the most obvious form of violence, but it is far lesser than objective violence in terms of what we've been talking about, the violence of the very functioning of the system itself.
I was gonna say what that does is it individualizes our relationship with violence, so that violence is only a thing that either I see out there or I individually am subjected to, and then it also puts up these kinds of walls between people so that your violence is only experienced on a subjective level. There's no kind of as much as there's an objective violence out there in the system, there's also a violence that kind of joins us who are subjected to that objective violence, and to not fall prey to the inclination to only interpret it through that subjective lens.
Because I mean a lot of the way the violence of the system is experienced is actually enjoyable, maybe, and invisible. Yeah, you might appreciate the phone in your hand, but that is an expression of violence.
Right. And once it gets centered around the particular individual, it's like, I won't participate in this mode of violence. But of course, like this,
it's like the problem with recycling. It's like thinking that if I can recycle, I'll solve global warming, right? Like that kind of 90s anarchist belief that if change starts at you just kind of signing out of society and becoming a vegan or something like that. Or one of Žižek's points that's a little harder, to grasp at first, is that he's opposed to kind of peacenik, anti-war mentality, because the fact is there are wars, and you can kind of explain it away in various terms. But he made a point actually in that recent lecture on March 4th in Austria, where he said, yeah, okay, maybe it's true in a certain sense. What's occurring in Ukraine is the result of American or Western imperialism, but like try explaining that to Ukrainians who are fighting the Russians. They're not going to say, I'm fighting this war to uphold Western imperialism. They're going to say, I'm fighting this fucking war because Russia has invaded my country and they want it to cease to exist.
Yeah, their right to self-determination, etc. I was thinking about this in regards to protests, and this will come up later in Todd's essay. What's the difference between a protest and a protest without a program? If you think about the Occupy Wall Street movement, protest as such seems to avoid program. It's a way of putting off radical change.
It's acting without acting.
I actually like the French word for protest. It's manifestation. It's a manifestation, or like a manifestation of the will of the people. You can say that. Yeah, maybe that's something we can get closer to at the end.
Sure.
The notion of Occupy, at least. I have something to say about that.
Yeah. So Todd continues. He says, despite this wide critical chastisement, it is my contention, to put it in the style of one of his own formulations, that Slavoj Žižek is not violent enough. He identifies the necessary violence of the radical act, of the act that challenges the givens of the ruling capitalist system, but he makes no sustained attempt to integrate the self-destructive violence of this act into his conception of emancipatory governance.
I think that's wrong.
Well, let's describe what he means, and then you can describe how he's wrong.
Music for a minute.
Basically, he's saying that Žižek should include or should extend his concept of violence not only to kind of act of revolution, act of emancipation, but also to use what Žižek describes of selling his mother into slavery, to see V for Vendetta Part 2 of what happens after the revolution. So Todd is saying that violence as a concept should be included in governing kind of after what we would consider as an ideal future for a new society.
I think that according to Todd's notion of emancipatory governments, that's probably true. The point that he makes about Žižek's idea, I think that there is, and I do want to get I'm going to dangle another matzo ball here for the end of our discussion, because I think that there is a Žižekian rejoinder to that point. But nonetheless, I think it's a fair claim to make, which he drives pretty hard into here in this essay, that there seems to be some kind of gap between what Žižek takes to be a subjective act and all of the violence entailed there, even in a revolutionary subject, and the problem of governance.
Because I mean, he does reference that V for Vendetta thing that Žižek says, but then he says that Žižek never actually kind of expands on what it might look like V for Vendetta Day 2. For Todd, it means violence as a kind of subjective self-questioning of subjectivity should be included in government, which questions itself. The violence is exerted upon itself, where it is not substantial, like all-powerful thing, is like subject to change and to the will of the people that it's governing.
Yeah. I mean, he actually didn't include this, but I thought this is something that Žižek talks about a lot, of the notion of a monarchy, which for Hegel and Žižek actually does do that, because the function of the monarch is this empty place that merely ratifies the will of the people, so that in the body of the king only says "I will," which means he wills what he's given to will. But discussion of a constitutional monarchy we'll leave for another day.
So is that the amendment over amendment? That
Yeah. I mean, like, I think we can just get to that. Like, we've had a long conversation so far. Well, actually, maybe we can talk about the Stalin thing. Like, he does focus on why is Stalin such a focal point for Žižek, especially when it's a very common way that people dismiss Žižek. Like, he's a Stalinist. You know, he has a photo of Stalin hanging in a very obvious place in his apartment, where, you know, you see interviews with him there. You see Stalin in the background. Why would Žižek do this? I thought his description of it was pretty good, actually. That for Žižek, the difference between the exception of Stalinism as opposed to Nazism, for instance, is that Stalinism is a failure to live up to its own emancipatory potential, whereas there was not a Nazism, where like at least the starting point of the Russian Revolution was with the stated goal of equality for all, you know, like a true kind of socialist system. That was the desire. And of course,
and he says that a strength of, I think Todd says this about Žižek's work, is that Žižek considers it a strength of Stalinism to be that the most dangerous place was in the nomenclatura, was at the very, you know, echelons of power in the Soviet Union, was the most dangerous place to be.
The terror included the people who ruled the society. I actually had, like, I think that's an interesting way of phrasing it, or of thinking about it.
It is, and he has a couple nice anecdotes there. There's the one that Žižek talks about all the time of prisoners in the Gulag writing Stalin a birthday card, which of course you can never imagine this in a concentration camp. And then also the joke about how Stalin one day decides to go and see a movie, and
to see how the people live.
At the beginning of the movie, there's a call for people to applaud Comrade Stalin, and everyone gets up and applauds, and Stalin doesn't. And one of the guys standing next to him says, "Comrade, I agree with not standing up, but it can be dangerous." I think there's a kind of like coincidence of opposites there, where like in some way, it's not just that Stalin doesn't get up and applaud, but the role of Stalin himself can be disbelieved in through the mechanism of believing in him.
Yeah, it was even dangerous for Stalin to be Stalin, especially since he's like with the possibility that he himself was assassinated by his own party. I wanted to make this point. I forgot about it when we were recapping Žižek, but his bit about how Stalin would applaud himself, he would join in applause instead of just like the Mussolini thing where he would just, you know, receive the applause. At this Žižek event, he joined in with the applause. It was pretty great.
Also on that lecture he gave the other day, it was time for questions, and Žižek was like, "Any questions?" And then he was like, "No." One has to be Stalinist here.
I'm just wondering, like, Todd's main point, like what undergirds this whole thing is the idea that violence is the first thing that happens in subjectivation. When you become a subject, the forced choice of subjectivation is violence. This is where the libidinal investment occurs. Do you think that is a genuine pattern? Todd calls it a pattern toward all political acts after.
Like the appearance of subjectivity is kind of reenacted in the way that it lives in the world. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, the way he says it is the violence of the death drive and its self-sabotage is the first emancipation that subsequently establishes the pattern for all political acts of emancipation.
Does that fit into what he's saying about repetition?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
Okay,
so like
yeah.
he's
So that
basically
would be the
saying
pattern,
that
right? The pattern of
becoming a
repetition?
subject is something violent. This sort
Yeah.
of contiguous emergence of the death drive and subjectivity. But why is the death drive violent? And Todd's
Because
thinking
it
Probably
involves
because it-
self-undermining, consistent
Right,
self-undermining. Yeah.
yeah, its aim is away from utility and survival, right? But why is that something to base a politics on?
I was thinking, where is the tension there between viewing one's existence, the subject's existence in the world, as a kind of individual versus thinking about politics as an amalgamation, as a kind of consistent whole, rather than like a bunch of individuals acting?
Mm.
Because wouldn't the leftist position be kind of viewing beyond one's own subjective position in the social world?
I think that is
Towards
the criticism that Todd is
collective?
making of what Žižek is saying, but
Yeah.
I feel like what joins those things together is this notion of the death drive and repetition. Because Žižek does describe death drive in a political way as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that, like, in terms of revolutions and revolutionary events, they repeat.
Right, but does it have to be one like the subject's own death drive? Like, does death drive exist kind of for instance, ideology? It's not one's own ideology because the subject is interpolated by ideology. It exists beyond the subject.
I think you could say that death drive exists beyond the subject.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. So like, I'm not sure you necessarily have to go like start with this violence of the subject and then build beyond that towards creating a politic from that subjective position.
I think this has a lot to do with Todd's Capitalism and Desire book. But what he says in the essay is self-sabotage is the first emancipation that subsequently establishes the pattern for all later political acts of emancipation. So,
and what do you think of that?
well, in some ways, he's saying like subjectivity is political, like coming into being of subject is political. So then the death drive is inherently political because it's inherently emancipatory.
Oh, I see what you mean.
It does seem like something that
seems
Todd would
like
say.
It does, but I think there's an inconsistency there, right? Because what then is the meaning of an act?
Well,
right?
okay. I think you could say this for Žižek, the antagonism at the heart of the social, and you could say, let's say, the central antagonism of the political or the real is the subject itself. So in that way, I think the subject is already wrapped up in that kind of supra subjective scenario.
But then
by its very existence.
Is there something kind of, is there like a foregone conclusion about the emancipatory movement of a subject?
It seems like an unfolding, right?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, no, it is.
It's not, but Žižek's point is that it's not automatically given.
Yeah.
No, but it, like in a dialectical materialist way, what occurs with capitalism is something that coincides with subjectivity itself. That is the severance from a particular encultured life world.
Sure, but the subject, we are a different subject under capitalism, but nonetheless, subjectivity exists before and after capitalism, before and after the revolution, and that they're not necessary conclusions of the existence of subjectivity itself.
Yeah, but I would still say that, yes, subject obviously exists prior to capitalism, but capitalism enacts something closer to the being of subjectivity as such. And in thinking about emancipation, maybe it's about pushing that forward, that something comes out of the severance from a particularized life world.
I think, unlike the example from They Live that you brought up, Will, with the two guys fighting, Todd is saying that Žižek's idea of violence and subjectivity is a striking against oneself. Like if you were to imagine that They Live scene, it will be a guy forcing himself to put on the glasses and beating himself until he does.
But that there's something outside of himself. Like you have to be made to be free is what he says in that.
Well,
and
that's
if it
the
was
forced
merely
choice.
an action, if there was merely an action of the self, how does that forced choice exist? How does the act exist? I think that reducing it completely to the subject where is the Hegelian notion of the subject as being defined by what is outside of itself?
Yeah, not only as subject, but also substance to turn it
Yeah.
around. I think that what you're saying is Todd's criticism of Žižek.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I would reiterate that there is something in that coincides or is homologous to the movement of subjectivity that is also enacted in revolution and emancipation.
Totally. But what we're saying is that Todd's argument here kind of depends on a almost teleological movement of the self towards revolution.
I think that's the criticism that he's making of Žižek. Yeah, but sorry, one more thing. It is true in Marxism that he thinks that there is a new kind of being that comes out of capitalism, which is the proletariat. Yeah. And I think that you can say that there is something about that movement that definitely coincides with what Žižek is saying, always says about the subject. There's a space opened up in the disappearance of...
Well, in the antagonism, but like social antagonism as such exists beyond capitalism. It's just different forms of antagonism.
Like, yeah, but emancipation comes... Okay, revolutionary theory and revolutions... genuine revolutions come out of or are produced out of the economic system, and the one that we have is capitalism.
Totally, I agree. Under the current system, there is not a non-capitalist subject, and is only within the system, according to Marx, that it's primed for that particular form of subject to reverse the economic dynamic and make it about their own well-being.
But he also claims that it's the only time that there can be genuine revolution.
Well, Todd's main argument in this essay is that death drive is the example for political act, right? That's how he interprets Žižek's whole project. Subjectivation itself is the exemplary model of a political act.
Yeah. I think that he was really strong on that point, and it seems like a pretty good, not gotcha, but like for the point that he's making, like it's a pretty good sustained criticism of what Žižek is saying in his project, because there does seem to be that kind of, how does he put it? There's a disjunct between what the subject is and what can be accomplished on a political scale.
He writes, well, just towards what we're talking about, he says, Žižek theorizes a permanent state of violence because he identifies violence with our subjectivity and with every act that repeats subjectivity's emergence. Žižek's act breaks from the symbolic structure in which it occurs. The primary rupture of the act occurs within the subject of the act and involves the subject breaking with its own investment in the symbolic structure. The real difficulty of Žižek's act lies not in the physical courage it might require, but in the psychic barriers standing in the way. This is why Žižek claims courage is a leftist value. And that's what you're saying, Michael. Like,
do you think it's because for Žižek, the notion of an event is pretty important, and I think it actually supplants his language of the act after the mid-2000s?
Yeah.
And Todd, I think, is pretty skeptical about the notion of an event.
I think he's still insisting on the kind of priority of like starting with the subject and building up from that. And of course, Žižek writes about that extensively. Also a great emphasis on what lies beyond the subject. For instance, as we discussed, ideology, the symbolic order.
And the event.
Yeah.
Todd's whole thing is that subjectivity is the paradigm for how we should conduct ourselves as political agents. It's open to criticism.
That's what I felt reading this. I was like, it doesn't quite seem right about Žižek's project with Todd saying that it's like primarily about this act of the subject, because I think there's another dimension to it also.
His main critique makes sense though, right? Like where Todd's saying that the quote is like, Žižek is loath to offer prescriptions for what the social order should ultimately look like. This is, as he sees it, one of the idealist missteps that Marx takes relative to Hegel's absolute materialism.
Like Žižek perceives it to be consistent with Hegel's position of the role of thought, the role of philosophy, painting gray on gray, only being able to describe things retroactively and not being able to be fully prescriptive in how you perceive events to unfold. And I think it's, in some ways it's also consistent with Marx, right? Like Marx doesn't spend a whole lot of time really writing about what his ideal society looks like, because he's writing about capitalist economic system and critiquing that as well. Yeah.
Todd's closing statement is, we can imagine a form of power that privileges striking against itself. Such a form of governance would translate the violence of the radical act into a rule of violence. Taking a cue from Žižek himself, we can lament, we have yet to invent a form of power violent enough to be adequate for our emancipation. I did find it interesting that, getting towards Žižek's response, that he basically ignores Todd's criticism of his system as such and focuses entirely on that last point.
Yeah, so Todd's move then is, instead of using an amendment system with an A, moving towards a amendment system with an E, where you don't add on to the Constitution, you change the Constitution. There's a constant violence against the very presuppositions of the state itself.
I guess I would just have to ask, is it a hard A or a soft E?
Basically, yeah, I guess we could just say that what he's getting from Stalinism via Žižek is that power itself was subject to its own authority, rather than this endless kind of like adding on of power. There's a violence upon the structure of power itself, and this is what he's doing with the amendment system.
Yeah. So then Žižek says, I agree with this point, but I was a little surprised by how, after a big roar about violence, McGowan ends up with a very modest proposal as to as a solution, emendation. And then he quotes what we were just talking about from Todd. And then Žižek says, I can easily imagine versions more pertinent than amendment with an A, which can also be abused by those in power to strengthen their rule, like abortion, etc. In his last active year, Lenin himself saw this problem. And he goes on to articulate this crackpot scheme that Lenin came up with, the Control Commission, that basically kind of like is charged with to make a point of showing that the place of power is primordially empty.
It is a bit sad, right? Like, Todd works through Žižek's ideas of violence for an entire essay and talks about Žižek not being violent enough. And imagine being Žižek and you read the essay, and then at the very end he's like, rather than an amendment, what about an amendment? And basically the structure remains exactly the same, except those that are responsible for the writing of the Constitution are now removed in such a way where each time that you refer to the Constitution, they dissolve and you continue to write it.
Right. And also, like, the system doesn't preclude a capitalist system either. It could still be consistent with basically the same functioning within
exactly
society.
Right.
There's pushes to rewrite the Constitution anyway right now. It's a very common liberal trope.
I actually thought that he slotted in his real point right at the end, slyly, where he says something that I think Todd is unwilling to accept, generally speaking. Žižek says, because today's situation calls for something like communism. And Žižek obviously has a complicated relationship with communism, but he's not purely joking about that, I don't think. And I did go on another kind of minor essay screed after reading that, if you'll indulge me for a few minutes, because I think that what Žižek's answer is, yes, there is such a system which you, Todd, are asking for. It's called communism.
Yeah. Something where Todd is very hesitant to make an argument for.
Let's just reread Todd's last statement. We can imagine a form of power that privileges striking against itself. Such a form of governance would translate the violence of the radical act into a rule of violence. Taking a cue from Žižek himself, we can lament, we have yet to invent a form of power violent enough to be adequate for emancipation. Okay, Žižek, I think, would definitely say that that's communism. I mean, he does say that it's communism.
Yeah.
Because at the end of Less Than Nothing, Žižek says, literally the last sentence, the communist horizon is peopled by 2 millennia of failed radical egalitarian rebellions from Spartacus onwards. Yes, they were all lost causes, but as G.K. Chesterton put it, the lost causes are exactly those which might have saved the world. So this is Žižek's most important book. What does he end it with? He says, he describes it as the communist horizon. It's what Badiou also calls the communist hypothesis. I think Todd can claim that something that Žižek says about Occupy, that it doesn't have any kind of coherent message, and you would like to see the day after Occupy, which we all did. But what Žižek is saying, and he wrote Less Than Nothing, like, right, he finished it, I think, right around when Occupy was happening. So quoting Žižek here, he says that any debate here and now, and I would add more specifically about the debate about what happens the day after, Žižek says, necessarily remains a debate on the enemy's turf. Time is needed to deploy the new content. All we can say now can be taken from us. Everything except our silence. And then I think that you can tie that in with the criticism that Todd is making that, Žižek is loath to explain the day after. Žižek's point being that discussion itself happens on enemy turf. Mm-hmm. And then he goes on with it. Žižek says, the silence that can't be taken from us, this rejection of dialogue of all forms of clinching is our terror, ominous and threatening as it should be. So I think in these terms, we can say that Todd's demand for Žižek to actually say it, to articulate exactly what will come, comes from, dare we say, an ideological apprehension on the terrain of the capitalist regime itself. Perhaps the very demand to know what we're getting into with emancipation at stake is the hold that capitalist ideology continues to constrain us with. And remember, Žižek's dictum, I would prefer not to, Bartleby, Žižek's refrain. Why? Because it constitutes a negative gesture. This is how, quoting Žižek, we pass from the politics of resistance, parasitical upon what it negates, to a politics which opens up a new space outside the hegemonic position and its negation. So I think, to sum up, it's pretty simple. Todd can't get down with Žižek because he's not a communist, and Žižek is.
Good point. That was very well put. Yeah. I think those are all very good points. I think aligning the two end parts of what they're saying, Todd saying, if only we could conceive of something like this, and Žižek saying, well, we have, it's called communism, but inbuilt in that notion is the negative space of communism. It's not just like, we'll do this and then we'll do that and then we'll do that.
Exactly. And I would say that, it's not just Todd's criticism. A lot of people have this, why can't, and Sophie mentioned this too, like, give us a prescription, tell us what to do. And Žižek isn't going to do that. And I'm saying that, like, I think that, quote it following Žižek there. I'm saying that, like, that might come from an investment in the, hegemonic ideology that says the desire to have. Getting there is going to be really violent. I'm not saying Todd's saying that, but, like, someone might say the criticism, as Žižek says, already comes from the enemy's turf.
Or even, like, if you just think about it from the perspective of a subject, someone might have the idea that they need to change their lives, and then, or, like, say you're a young person trying to figure your life out, and then your parents, the authority goes, okay, tell me exactly what you want to do. Mm-hmm. In order to make any change, you have to give me the exact thing you're going to do. And of course, whenever
that happens, you can't say anything.
Yeah.
I guess the other big piece of news that we haven't discussed on the pod is that we actually, Peter and I, went and saw Žižek lecture twice in a period of days at Seton Hall in New Jersey and at NYU in New York. And our good friend Russ Sbriglia set up a face-to-face meeting with the man himself. We took a train out to New Jersey, and we were walking towards, it was this very kind of nice campus area, quad area that we were walking through, and it was dusk. And me and Peter and his girlfriend were approaching the building, and we saw up ahead of us 3 figures, and Peter jokingly said that we should just follow those hipsters over there. And then we realized that it was actually Žižek, Todd, and Russ. And so first we met Russ, who was a wonderful guy, very nice. And then he introduced us to Todd, who I gotta say he was wearing a leather jacket. He was looking pretty cool.
Todd was looking cooler than I wasn't expecting it to not be, but he looked great. He was wearing a little hat. He was, like, kind of lounging on the couch, like, with his arm up, legs crossed.
Mm-hmm. And sitting next to him was Slavoj.
In the middle of it, he was, like, in the middle of conversation. We walk in, and he's, like, still talking. And he's talking about how there needs to be more, like, of a direct authority in academic departments.
And then Russ interjects and says, these are the podcast guys. And, all credit to Žižek. He didn't really care that much, but that was cool.
It was fine. But he was like, oh, you're the podcast guys. And we shook his hand.
And then he picked up mid-sentence where he left off.
He acknowledges us. And then he looks at my girlfriend, and he's like, oh, are you in the podcast too? And she was just like, no, I'm just along for the ride. And he's like, Back in the old Soviet Union days, we had a name for someone like you, fellow traveler. And then Todd nods along, fellow
Todd
traveler.
said fellow traveler at the same time. Fellow traveler.
And then he's like, "Yep, but you know, when the revolution comes, you'll be the first to be liquidated." And I will forever be jealous that he told her instead of me that I would be liquidated.
Yeah.
And then we went and saw the lecture, and let me tell you, this is the first time I've seen Žižek. It was exactly how you would expect it to be in all the positive ways. He just goes, and it was fascinating. It was a great lecture.
It's full of energy. At one point in the lecture, he's talking about the dependency and similarity between wokeness and the right wing, and how they like need and require each other for their existence. And I remember looking over at the students like beside me, and one guy was like leaning forward, like mouth agape, like he couldn't believe what he was saying.
Yeah. And then we were walking back to the train, and there was this student who left ahead of us, and she was on the phone to her father. And
she was the picture of what the hysterical right wing people think is happening at the university.
She was utterly gobsmacked by what Žižek had said. Like, she could not fucking handle it, and she was really angry about it. So it was fun kind of listening to her rampage about what Žižek had said.
But the interesting thing was there was nothing specific in what he had said that was bothering her. Like, it was just the vibe. Like, she wasn't like, "Oh, I can't believe that he said this," and it gave a specific example.
But that was funny nonetheless. And then we saw him a couple days later at NYU, which was it was more intimate.
Yeah.
And kind of a more like primed crowd, I thought. So
a lot of people like wearing black with the right type of tote bag.
Mm-hmm. And it was also interesting to see how Žižek kind of tailored his lecture differently.
But yeah, it was pretty surreal meeting him.
It's just funny because he's like, it almost goes without saying, but he's exactly the same in person, in the flesh, as he is everywhere else.
Just when we were standing there kind of observing him talk after we made introductions, he was like just pontificating, just a seamless flow of ideas.
Yeah, he's talking about Derrida and
Marcuse. Yeah. And then he played some piano for us. From everyone here at Žižek and so on, we'd like to thank you from the bottom of our heavy hearts for taking the time to deal with the most problematic person in the world. Worse maybe than Hitler. And yeah. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
And so on and so on. 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 And so on and so on.